The cul-de-sac lay quiet under a late summer sun, the kind of light that makes every hedge glisten with a suspicious neatness. In this neighborhood, order was not just a virtue, it was a currency, traded in fines and fine print. The HOA, a committee of well-pressed shirts and sharper elbows, kept the ledger of appearances with a merciless discipline. On Popular Lane, the houses stood like careful portraits, each lawn a canvas bordered by precise edges, each mailbox a postcard from a life that could only exist within the HOA's approving gaze. The seed of discord arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in the form of a short, almost routine notice. The language was bureaucratic, the kind that sounded innocent enough until it settled in the mind and gnawed at the edges. A minor adjustment to the rules about exterior decor, a clarification about the symmetry of shrubbery, a tightening of the leash on seasonal displays. It was the sort of change that families could endure with a sigh, chalking it up to the capriciousness of committees and the endless supply of glossy minutes. Yet within those margins lay a spark, subtle and dangerous, a spark that would soon crack open the veneer of quiet suburbia. In the days that followed, the first signs were modest, almost theatrical in their restraint. A few lawns spruced up with new edging to comply, a handful of mailboxes repainted to the exact shade the HOA prescribed, a chorus of porch lights adjusted to meet a precise intensity. The neighborhood inhaled, counted the breaths, and exhaled in unison, as if to say, "This is manageable, this is orderly, this is as it should be." But beneath the surface a current began to run. Listening to the hum of the network, the HOA's email threads, the private message boards, the doorbell cameras that recorded every motion in crisp, unambiguous resolution. The most telling instrument of the new regime was not the spreadsheet or the rule book, but the HOA meeting. The meetings were a ritual, a monthly assembly where residents gathered in a room that smelled faintly of coffee and old receipts, and where the minutes were as ceremonial as a verdict. The chair, a person whose name appeared on the agenda with a flourish, spoke in measured tones about compliance, about standards, about the virtue of consistency. The audience listened with a mixture of admiration and wariness, as if they were watching a performance of a moral play, where the protagonist might be anyone in the room, including themselves. What followed was not a single dramatic gesture, but a choreography of small acts, each one a possible cue for a neighborhood to spiral towards spectacle. A resident had decorated a balcony with summer lanterns that glowed too brightly after the permitted hour. A rival committee member pointed to the daylight with a calculator in hand, counting violations as if tallying a harvest. The HOA's enforcement arm tightened its grip, sending polite but firm notices that felt, to those on the edge of compliance, almost personal. The notices carried a threat of fines, but more threatening than money was the suggestion that the HOA was watching, always watching, through the pins of a pinhole camera, through the lens of a neighbor's doorbell, through the cold, clinical light of a shared internet that never slept. In this environment, a single resident began to crystallize as the unlikely fulcrum of change. She did not march with banners, did not rally the others in a dinner-table referendum. Instead, she operated with the efficiency of a quiet engineer, naming problems, outlining procedures, documenting every slight, every error, every anomaly. She kept meticulous notes, cataloged every email thread, and archived the minutes not for posterity, but for leverage. Her work was not flamboyant, it was procedural, almost ceremonial in its fidelity to order. Yet the effect was electric. The HOA, which had built its authority on the public's acquiescence,
found itself confronted with a new adversary who did not shout or threaten, but simply refused to surrender the ground of the written rule. What sparked the turning point, when the quiet began to tremble, was not a dramatic violation, but a cascade of small, logical deductions. The resident compared the new rule with older amendments, traced the chain of approvals, and uncovered a detail that had been glossed over. One that suggested sloppy governance, or perhaps something more intentional. A discretionary line in the policy that appeared to give window dressing discretion to the chair's own preferences. The transcripts of meetings, carefully preserved on a shared drive, revealed moments where votes had swung not with the weight of consensus, but with the quiet, almost invisible pressure of a single persuasive argument from someone with authority who preferred a particular aesthetic. It was during a late summer evening, under the glow of a street lamp that threw long, accusatory shadows across the pavement, that the kernel of a story began to spread across the cul-de-sac. A routine complaint about a neighbor's holiday lights became the spark that ignited the broader flame. The resident who had become the quiet instrument of accountability began to stitch together a timeline of the HOA's decisions, the correspondence that had passed between members, and the microaggressions that often accompany such micro-regulations, the tone, the cadence, the implied rebukes that carried more weight than any written line could express. As the days lengthened into weeks, the neighborhood shifted from polite compliance to a more charged posture. The HOA's public-facing channels, the website, the inbox, the social media feeds became a grid where arrows could be traced from the original rule to the latest enforcement, a cartography of control. The doorbell cameras, those ever-watchful eyes at the threshold of private life, began to feed a different kind of truth. Footage that showed the human faces behind the policy, the reactions when fines were levied, the cunning in the way mail arrived marked notice, the sudden hush when a well-timed reminder call interrupted a quiet evening. In this new atmosphere, the story found its protagonist a second time. The resident who kept records did not seek to destroy the HOA, but to reconstitute it as something less brittle and more transparent. She began to share her compiled evidence in a carefully curated sequence, a digital mosaic that painted a broader picture than any single rule could. The mosaic did not shout, it invited. It asked the community to examine the process, to understand the importance of checks and balances, to consider what a neighborhood deserved when a single committee held the power of both watchman and judge. The cul-de-sac, once content to listen to the smooth patter of the HOA secretary's voice, now found itself listening to the hum of the subscribed video feed that documented the streets in a new light. The footage from doorbell cams, once private, had become a chorus, each clip a note in a longer symphony about accountability. The minutes, once a dry record of motions and phrases, were now a living archive that stood as evidence of how rule changes travel from the paper to the pavement, from the legalese to the living rooms, from the silent agreement to a chorus of questions. On the surface, the changes were gradual. More detailed notices, a stricter adherence to the calendar, a stern reminder of consequences for non-compliance. Yet beneath the surface, a transformation was underway. The HOA, which had valued uniformity above all, discovered a new virtue in scrutiny. The neighborhood, which had lived in the comforting shadow of rules, learned to recognize when those rules shadowed people more than they protected them. The camera that once served as a silent sentinel for conformity now served as a beacon, guiding a community toward a more open conversation about what it meant to live together under a shared code. As the sun set on the last day of the chapter, the cul-de-sac held its breath. The lights in the houses flickered in a synchronized, almost ceremonial cadence, echoing the quiet heartbeat of a neighborhood that was learning to see itself anew. The doorbell cams still watched, still recorded, but the angle of their gaze had shifted. They no longer simply witnessed violations. They documented an evolving narrative of governance, one that could not be reduced to fines or to a list of colors approved for shutters or to the precise distance a wreath must hang from the door. It was something more substantial, a question posed to the community about what kind of oversight the people deserved and what kind of responsibility they were willing to shoulder together.